Have you ever stumbled upon a seemingly normal situation that turned out to be a horrifying mystery? One night, Officer Ethan Cole pulls over a car for a routine check. But when he glances at the back seat, his blood runs cold. A terrified little girl clutches a doll, and the man in the front seat is hiding something. What happens next will send chills down your spine. A dangerous kidnapper, a deadly secret, and a race against time to save the child. What Ethan uncovers will shock you. Stay tuned to the end to find out the truth. Before we dive in, drop a comment about where you're watching from, like the video, and subscribe for more thrilling stories. Let's get started. Sergeant Ethan Cole was cruising down the deserted suburban road, the last light of the evening slowly fading behind the horizon, casting a faint glow on the pavement. The air was still, the kind of quiet that always seemed to hang heavy in small towns like this. Ethan was just about to turn down a side street when he saw it. A gray sedan slipping past a stop sign without even slowing down. It wasn't an uncommon sight in a town where most people were more concerned with getting home than following every traffic law. But this time, something about it made Ethan's instincts flare. He flicked on his patrol lights, the bright blue beams flashing against the fading twilight. The sedan didn't hesitate, but pulled over slowly, almost as if the driver was stalling, or perhaps trying to hide something. Ethan's hand instinctively rested on the holster of his weapon, just in case. As he walked toward the car, his boots echoed against the empty street, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. The window rolled down with a low creak, revealing a middle-aged man behind the wheel. His name, as it would turn out, was Greg Hansen. His face wore a strained, awkward smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Those eyes, however, told a different story. They darted around rapidly, never quite meeting Ethan's gaze. It was the kind of nervous energy that screamed guilty to someone with as much experience as Ethan. The man's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Evening," Ethan said, his voice calm but sharp, as he kept a few feet of distance between them. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Greg hesitated. For a moment, his lips parted, as if he were about to speak, but then closed again. He took a deep breath, visibly forcing himself to stay composed. I didn't see the sign, officer," he said, his voice unsteady. It was a weak excuse, and Ethan's trained eyes caught the subtle tremor in Greg's words. Ethan murmured, not entirely buying it. "You didn't see the sign, or you just didn't care?" He let the question hang in the air, but Greg didn't seem to know how to answer. His face twitched with discomfort, and his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, then to the passenger seat. He was avoiding the question, but more importantly, he was avoiding Ethan's gaze. Ethan's senses heightened. There was more to this stop than a simple traffic violation. He took a step closer, observing every small movement, every change in Greg's posture. The man shifted uncomfortably, swallowing hard, his throat bobbing with the effort. "You're in a hurry?" Ethan asked, his voice suddenly colder, more probing. "Where are you headed?" Greg's lips parted again, but the words didn't come. He glanced out the window as if he were searching for an escape, but the road was empty. His eyes darted back to Ethan, and in that brief moment, Ethan saw something, a flicker of panic. I've just had a long day. I was heading home," Greg stammered, but the way he said it made Ethan's skin crawl. It was too quick, too rehearsed. Ethan's gaze shifted to the back seat. It was dimly lit, but he could make out a large, nondescript bag resting on the seat. A duffel bag, its bulging form noticeable even in the low light. His eyes narrowed. Greg noticed the shift in attention and immediately reached for the door handle, but not fast enough to hide the nervousness creeping into his movements. "What's in the bag?" Ethan asked, his tone firm now. The question wasn't just a passing curiosity, it was an instinctual demand. Greg hesitated again, and in that split second, Ethan knew something was wrong. Greg's face flushed, and he cleared his throat awkwardly, then mumbled, "Just clothes, officer. Nothing special." But his voice cracked, and the way he looked away told Ethan everything he needed to know. Ethan stepped back, assessing the situation. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the pieces began to fall into place. A minor traffic violation wasn't supposed to feel this heavy, this dangerous. But everything about Greg's behavior screamed that there was more to the story. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Ethan ordered, his voice now sharp with authority. Greg didn't move immediately, but after a moment of strained silence, he slowly opened the door and stepped out. The air around them felt colder now, charged with an electric tension. As Greg stood there, shifting uncomfortably on the curb, Ethan knew this wasn't just a routine stop anymore. There was something in that bag, something that didn't belong. But the real question was, what was Greg hiding, and why was he so desperate to cover it up? Ethan had no idea what was in that bag, but he was certain of one thing. This was no ordinary traffic stop. Something much bigger was about to unfold. And Greg Hansen was at the heart of it. As Ethan's flashlight swept over the back seat, his heart clenched in his chest. There, curled up in the corner, was a little girl, no older than 7, her black hair falling messily over her face. She clutched a well-worn doll in her tiny hands, her knuckles white from the tight grip. Her eyes, wide and filled with raw fear, locked onto Ethan's. The depth of terror in her gaze hit him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, the world seemed to fade away as he stared at her, his mind racing. She didn't say a word. Her lips were tight, pressed together in a line as if she had been trained not to speak, not to make a sound. When Ethan gently asked if she was all right, her only response was a slow, mechanical nod. It was like she was on autopilot, her body moving without thought, her face devoid of emotion. Yet the fear was still there, lingering in the shadows of her eyes. Before Ethan could ask more, Greg Hansen abruptly interjected, his voice tight with anxiety. "This is my daughter, Anna. She's just tired, officer. It's been a long day for her." His words were rushed, almost too quick, like a rehearsed explanation. He sounded too defensive, and the way his eyes flicked toward Anna revealed something Ethan couldn't ignore. There was more to this than fatigue. Ethan didn't break his gaze from Anna. His intuition told him something was wrong, something deeper than simple exhaustion. As Greg reached out to touch his daughter's shoulder, Ethan saw it, the subtle but unmistakable flinch in Anna's posture. She recoiled slightly, pulling away from Greg's touch as if it burned her, her small body shrinking into the corner of the seat. It was a tiny movement, but it was enough to send a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. Greg seemed to notice too. He froze for a moment, the moment of hesitation before he quickly withdrew his hand and gave a stiff smile. But Ethan wasn't fooled. There was a shift in the air now, something unsaid, something lurking in the quiet tension between the two of them. Greg's attempt to brush it off only made it more obvious. Whatever was going on between him and Anna, it wasn't just the tiredness of a long day. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes still locked on the girl. "Anna," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm. "Are you okay? You don't have to be scared." But she didn't respond, her gaze still fixed on him, the fear in her eyes growing more intense with every second. Ethan felt his throat tighten. The subtle signs, the way she flinched, the way Greg seemed to rush through his explanation, told him there was a much darker story unfolding right in front of him. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "She's just shy, officer. That's all. We're heading home now. Please, can we just—" But Ethan wasn't listening. His mind was focused entirely on Anna, and the chilling suspicion that was growing like a dark cloud in his thoughts. There was no way this was just a tired little girl. Something had happened to her. Something that Greg was desperately trying to hide. Ethan wasn't sure what it was, but he was certain of one thing. He wasn't going to let this go. As the patrol car's headlights disappeared into the distance, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly off. He had done his job, had followed procedure, and yet there was a gnawing doubt in his chest that refused to settle. The encounter had felt strange, unsettling. The man, Greg, had been too quick to answer, too defensive, and then there was Anna. Her eyes, those wide, terrified eyes, were burned into his mind. He had asked her simple questions, but her responses were distant, mechanical, as if she didn't trust him or anyone else. Most disturbing of all was the way she flinched when Greg had touched her shoulder, a subtle but unmistakable sign of fear. It was as though she was afraid of him, her father, or so Greg had claimed. But Ethan wasn't sure. Nothing about their interaction felt right. Back at the station, Ethan sat in front of his computer, his mind racing. He couldn't let go of the nagging feeling. It kept him up, making his heart pound with unease. The clock ticked on, but he couldn't concentrate on his other duties. His eyes kept drifting to the image of Anna in the back seat of that car. So small, so fragile, clinging to her doll as if it were her only source of comfort in a world that suddenly seemed very unsafe. He had to know more. With a steadying breath, Ethan logged into the police database and entered the vehicle's license plate. He ran the numbers quickly, his fingers trembling just slightly as the search results appeared on the screen. He wasn't prepared for what came next. The name that popped up was like a punch to the gut. Anna Brooks, 7 years old, missing from a park 3 days ago. The date of her disappearance, the description of her clothing, it all matched. His stomach churned as he leaned in closer, rereading the details. This was no coincidence. The girl in that car, the one who had looked at him with such fear, was the same girl that had been reported missing. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Ethan had let them go. He had let them drive off. He had no reason to hold them, no probable cause, but now it was clear. Greg Hansen was not Anna's father. He was her captor. The realization hit him like a wave, cold and suffocating. Ethan could almost feel his heart stop for a moment. He had let the kidnapper slip right through his fingers. He replayed the encounter in his mind over and over, each moment taking on new meaning. The way Greg had avoided his gaze, how he had brushed off his questions too quickly. The way Anna had shrunk into herself, barely speaking, barely making eye contact. It all pointed to one inescapable truth. This was no father and daughter. Greg had stolen Anna, and now he had to be stopped. Ethan's blood ran cold. He stood up abruptly, his hands now shaking more than before. He rushed to the phone, dialing dispatch with a sense of urgency that he had never felt before. "We need backup. Immediately. I need a unit to track down a vehicle with license plate XYZ 123. It's the car from the incident earlier tonight. The girl inside is missing. She's been kidnapped, and the man with her is the one responsible." His voice was steady, but there was a panic just beneath the surface. He wasn't sure how long Greg had been able to stay under the radar, but he knew it wouldn't take much longer for him to slip through the cracks again. Ethan grabbed his jacket and rushed out the door, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Every second that passed was a second too long. He needed to find Anna before Greg had a chance to take her further away, to hide her in some dark corner where no one would ever find her again. The thought made his chest tighten, his breath short. His mind was already racing ahead, formulating a plan of action, but deep down, Ethan knew that time was not on their side. He was the only one who had seen through the lies. Now it was up to him to bring Anna home. Ethan's heart raced as he quickly issued an all-points bulletin for the gray sedan. The chase was on, but every second felt like an eternity. His mind was consumed with the image of Anna's frightened face and the dark fear he had seen in her eyes. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, Greg had been nothing more than a man who'd made a small mistake on the road, running a stop sign. But now, that mistake had unlocked a terrifying truth, and Ethan knew he couldn't waste any more time. The first lead came in quickly. A gas station attendant had seen the gray sedan pull up. Greg had gone inside to buy some snacks, but the way the little girl clutched her doll and stared at the floor told the woman something was horribly wrong. She didn't speak, but her eyes said it all. Anna was trapped in a nightmare. Her silence was a cry for help. Ethan's stomach churned as he pictured the little girl, so small and vulnerable, caught in the clutches of someone who wasn't her father. The more he learned, the more certain he became that Greg wasn't just a nervous, harried man. He was hiding something far darker. Next came a tip from a waitress at a diner. She remembered Greg sitting at a corner booth, constantly glancing out the window, as if expecting someone to come after him. His nervous behavior struck her as odd, but it wasn't until later, after hearing about Anna's missing person report, that the pieces fell into place. Greg was on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, and never once allowed Anna to speak for herself. It was clear to Ethan now, Greg was terrified, but not for the reasons he'd first thought. He wasn't just trying to avoid a traffic ticket or avoid notice, he was fleeing. His eyes darting around, his unsteady movements, they all painted a picture of a man who knew the walls were closing in on him. Ethan's pulse quickened when a third call came in. The receptionist at a local motel had just checked in Greg and rented him room 8. It had been only 20 minutes since he paid for the room, which meant Greg was still there, still in the area. That was the break Ethan had been waiting for. The sense of urgency that had been building in him since he first pulled over Greg escalated to a fever pitch. Time was running out. Ethan knew they were incredibly close, but every moment spent waiting felt like a gamble. Greg might vanish, and Anna might never be found. Ethan couldn't let that happen. The pieces were all falling into place, but they had to act quickly. Without hesitation, Ethan gathered his team and set a course for the motel. His instructions were clear: surround the building, cut off any possible escape routes, and move in fast. As the team arrived, the quiet of the night seemed to hang heavy in the air, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional flicker of motel lights. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the kind of anticipation that felt like it could break at any moment. Ethan's mind raced through every possible scenario. The motel room was on the second floor, and if Greg had locked the door or barricaded it, they would have to break it down. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his radio crackling to life. "Team ready for entry," a voice reported. Ethan gave a quick nod. It was now or never. They couldn't give Greg any more time to prepare, to escape, or to hurt Anna. This was it, the final stretch of the chase. Ethan stood by the door, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He could almost hear the thudding of his own heart in his ears. The search, the endless hours of following leads, had led them here, to room 8. To Anna. Everything had come to this point. Ethan couldn't afford to falter now. He had to get Anna out, no matter what. He gave the signal. His team was already moving into position, surrounding the building, ready for the confrontation. Ethan knew that Greg wouldn't go down without a fight. He had seen it in his eyes, the desperation, the fear, and the readiness to do anything to escape. But Ethan had something Greg didn't, the will to protect an innocent life. As the team prepared for entry, the adrenaline coursing through Ethan's veins made everything else blur into the background. There was only one thing on his mind: getting to that room, getting Anna out, and making sure Greg would never hurt her, or anyone again. The moment had arrived. The hunt was almost over. Ethan moved swiftly through the shadows, his team flanking him on either side as they approached the dimly lit motel. The air was thick with tension, every footstep calculated, every breath controlled. The neon sign above the entrance flickered lazily, casting eerie flashes of red and blue onto the pavement. Room 8 was just ahead. They had one shot at this, and Ethan wasn't going to let Greg slip away again. They reached the door, weapons drawn, their movements silent but deadly precise. Through the thin curtains, Ethan could see a flicker of movement. Greg was inside, pacing. Then, the glow of a lighter illuminated the room for a brief moment as he lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly, completely unaware of the storm about to break through his door. The moment was now. Ethan gave the signal. A swift, powerful kick sent the door flying open. "Police! Hands in the air!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the stale motel air like a blade. Greg's head snapped toward them, his face twisting in shock and panic. For a split second, he was frozen, his cigarette slipping from his lips. Then, in an act of pure desperation, he bolted, lunging for the back door. He didn't make it far. Ethan was faster. With a surge of strength, he tackled Greg mid-stride, slamming him hard against the wall. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and before he could react, Ethan had his arm twisted behind his back, shoving him down onto the dirty motel carpet. Greg let out a strangled grunt, thrashing beneath him, but Ethan's grip was like iron. "You're done, Greg," Ethan growled, tightening the cuffs around his wrists as his team secured the perimeter. Greg struggled, his breath ragged, but he knew he wasn't going anywhere. The chase was over. But Ethan wasn't done yet. His heart was pounding for a different reason now. Where was Anna? His eyes darted around the room, searching, but there was no sign of her. The bed was unmade, the lamp knocked over, the stale air thick with cigarette smoke, but no little girl. Panic spiked in Ethan's chest. Then he saw it. The closet door. Slightly ajar. A shadow shifting inside. Ethan moved toward it, his pulse hammering, every fiber of his being bracing for what he might find. He reached for the handle, his breath caught in his throat, and yanked the door open. There, curled up in the corner, was Anna. Her small body was trembling, her arms wrapped tightly around her doll, her face buried against it as if trying to disappear. The moment the door opened, she flinched violently, letting out a tiny, muffled whimper. Ethan immediately knelt down, softening his voice. "Anna," he said gently. "It's okay. You're safe now." She didn't move at first, her whole body locked in fear, as if she couldn't believe the nightmare was over. But then, slowly, her teary eyes lifted to meet his. And in that moment, Ethan knew. This was why he did what he did. This was the moment that mattered most. Greg was on the ground, hands cuffed behind his back, still struggling as Ethan secured him with practiced precision. His breath was heavy, his pulse racing, but the job wasn't finished, not yet. Something gnawed at him, a feeling that this was too easy. Greg had fought, but not as much as Ethan had expected from a man desperate enough to abduct a child. It was as if he had been buying time. But for what? Ethan turned toward the motel room, stepping inside. The air was thick with the stale scent of cigarettes and sweat, the dim light barely illuminating the grimy walls. His eyes scanned the room in seconds, searching for the one thing that mattered most, Anna. And then he saw her. She was curled up on the bed, her small frame trembling, knees drawn tightly to her chest. Her doll, worn and tattered, was clutched in her hands like a lifeline. But it was her eyes that hit Ethan the hardest, wide, frozen in terror, locked onto something beyond him. Not him. Something behind him. A chill ran down his spine as he followed her gaze. His stomach clenched the moment he saw it. The back door was open, just a sliver, swaying slightly as if someone had just slipped through. Ethan's hand went to his weapon instantly. Someone else was here. Someone had been in this room with her. Greg wasn't working alone. Ethan moved quickly, stepping toward the door, his breath steady but his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to be ready for anything. He pushed the door open with his foot, sweeping his gun toward the darkness beyond. The dim glow of a street lamp barely reached the alley behind the motel, casting long, shifting shadows. The night was silent. Too silent. Then a sound. A rustle. A quick movement just beyond his line of sight. Ethan's grip on his gun tightened. His training kicked in. "Police! Step out where I can see you." His voice cut through the quiet, sharp and commanding. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the distant hum of cars on the highway, the flickering motel sign buzzing in the wind. Then footsteps. Fast, deliberate, retreating into the night. Ethan didn't hesitate. He bolted through the door, his boots pounding against the pavement as he rounded the corner of the motel. His eyes locked onto a figure in the distance, slipping through the shadows, a man, dressed in dark clothes, moving fast. Ethan gave chase, his breath coming hard, adrenaline burning through his veins. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was something bigger. And the man running ahead of him? He wasn't just an accomplice. He was a predator, and he had just slipped through Ethan's fingers. Ethan's heart raced as he sprinted toward the alley, the cold night air biting at his skin. His breath clouded in the darkness, his senses sharp as he closed in on the figure in front of him. He didn't need to see the face to know this wasn't Greg. This was someone else. Someone more dangerous. Out of nowhere, a blur of movement erupted from the shadows. The man, his face obscured by a dark hood, emerged from behind a dumpster, a gleaming knife flashing under the faint light. Before Ethan could react, the attacker lunged, the blade aimed directly at his throat. He was fast, but Ethan was faster. His instincts kicked in, and he twisted to the side, narrowly avoiding the slash. The blade missed by inches, the cold metal grazing his jacket. With a swift movement, Ethan grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it violently to disarm him. The attacker growled, pulling back to strike again, but Ethan had already anticipated the move. He spun, using the attacker's momentum against him, and locked his arm in a painful hold, pinning him to the ground in a matter of seconds. The man struggled beneath him, but Ethan's grip was unyielding. They rolled across the gravel, the sound of their bodies hitting the ground like thunder in the night. The fight was brutal, muscles straining, teeth gritting, every second feeling like a battle for survival. Ethan could feel the man's rage radiating through his clenched fists, but he remained calm, focused. With one final, decisive move, Ethan twisted the man's arm behind his back, forcing him into submission. The knife clattered to the ground as the attacker screamed in pain. Ethan's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was filled with cold fury. "It's over, you bastard." As the man groaned, his body jerking with frustration, Ethan slapped the cuffs on him, securing him to the ground. The fight had been short, but it had revealed everything Ethan needed to know. This wasn't just some random act of violence. It was part of something much larger, and Greg wasn't acting alone. They were all involved in something far more sinister. Ethan's eyes flickered to the dark alley around him. The silence was oppressive now, but he knew the storm was far from over. This was only the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Greg Hansen and his accomplice were sentenced to life in prison. The prosecutor's closing remarks echoed in Ethan's mind, a blur of justice served. But as the gavel struck, marking the end of a long and harrowing chapter, Ethan felt a strange emptiness wash over him. He knew he had done his job, he had caught the criminals, he had brought Anna back to safety. But there was something far more meaningful than the conviction, something that lingered long after the courtroom doors had closed. It was the moment he saw Anna again, her small frame standing in front of him, her eyes filled with gratitude. She had been through hell, yet now, standing here, she was a picture of hope. Without a word, she ran into his arms, holding him tightly, as if she never wanted to let go. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he returned the embrace, his hand gently resting on the back of her head. Her voice, barely above a whisper, cracked the silence. "Thank you for saving me," she said, her words barely audible, but the weight of them hit him like a freight train. For a moment, Ethan could hardly speak. His voice caught in his chest, but he managed to smile, ruffling her hair gently. "Just doing my job, kiddo," he replied softly. As Anna pulled away, her eyes still wet with tears, Ethan watched as she was reunited with her parents. The joy in their reunion was overwhelming, but it was that simple, heartfelt thank you that truly resonated with him. It was a reminder of why he put on the badge every day, why he risked his life, because in this chaotic world, moments like this made it all worthwhile. The case was closed. The criminals were behind bars. But for Ethan, this was the moment that would stay with him forever. It wasn't about the justice or the convictions. It was about saving lives, protecting the innocent, and the quiet, unspoken gratitude that made it all meaningful. And in that small, precious moment with Anna, Ethan knew, without a doubt, why he had never given up on this line of work. It wasn't the badge, the uniform, or the awards. It was the difference he made, one life at a time.